From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Romulo Lollato standing by to offer his latest assessment of the Kansas wheat crop as it nears harvest readiness. Among other things, he'll talk about how the hot weather over the last 2 weeks has impacted that final grain fill. Then, on the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk from the Farm Service Agency, Carla Wikoff reports on the just-announced revisions to the Conservation Reserve Program that ought to appeal to you producers and landowners. And further ahead on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee covers a new study of prairie dog activity and how that affects forage consumption by grazing cattle. All that and more here on Agriculture Today. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Our guest has been spending a fair amount of time on the road in recent weeks, attending the wheat plot tours hosted by K-State Research and Extension, and we've asked him to bring us his observations concerning the state of winter wheat in Kansas as we head rapidly down the home stretch toward harvest time. Romulo Lollato is with us once again, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Romulo, when we last talked with you, you had finished up the wheat tour, and there were some encouraging signs about the crop at that time, several weeks back now. What's your latest take on the state of Kansas winter wheat?
Hi, Eric. Yes, well, thanks for having me on air here today. It's always good to be here talking to you and talking about wheat. And so in the wheat quality tour, we were finding that in the north central and northwest parts of the state, we were seeing quite a bit of variability in terms of growth stages of the crop, right? At that point in time, we would walk into a field and part of the field would already be at the flowering stages or as far as some early grain filling, and portions of the same field will still be at the put stage. So a lot of within field variability, and that variability is challenging in terms of herbicide program, in terms of fungicide timing decisions. And so definitely it was somewhat challenging for growers. And that variability was coming from the dry month of October that we had at crop establishment, right? So that really affected central Kansas, north central, and northwest parts of the state. As we moved to southwest Kansas, we were seeing a crop that was extremely drought stressed, especially south of Sharon Springs and Syracuse in that region. That had been up to that time very drought stressed. Of course, we had a lot of moisture during the month of May, but at that time the crop was still considerably drought stressed. We were seeing symptoms of drought stress as well all the way to about Edwards County, but then they were more moderate, right? It was just like the lower canopy we had lost some leaves. We were on the process of losing some pillars as well by the time that moisture came around. In south central Kansas, the crop was more uniform. The crop was actually in a relatively better shape. So that's the picture that we were painting around the wheat quality tour time that was in the mid to late part of May. Since then, we after that, we still had about 2 weeks or so of very cool temperatures. And so the month of May overall was cool and moist. And that, to some extent, delayed the development of the crop. So up to about that early portion of June, we could say that the crop was about a week behind or more. We usually start harvesting our own plots in between the June 7th to June 10th. And we were thinking that we wouldn't start probably until that June 17th or June 20th. So we were considering about 10 days to 2 weeks behind. The crop was behind in maturity up to that early part of the month of June. And that was true for the majority of the state. Now, another thing that was going on back then was a lot of moisture during flowering, right? And that was true for the majority of the state. We're seeing during the wheat quality tour a lot of moisture available in the heads around flowering. And those conditions are actually great for scab development, right? Fusarium head blight. And so that's a disease that affects the heads and the kernels of the crop. And so the conditions were perfect at that point in time, even though we were not seeing that yet. So that was the picture that we were painting at that point.
Have we seen then, since you bring it up, Romulo, evidence of scab now building up in those heads, as once again, we're not all that far from the very early harvest point in the state, and the full harvest maybe a week and a half or so away.
Yeah, most definitely, Eric. So we are seeing several fields that got infected with scab. And usually it's a disease that is more restricted to the central part of the state and eastern Kansas, where those conditions of moisture around flowering are more common, and especially in fields that were planted after corn, right? So that's the majority of what we see. And so this year, because the conditions were also great for scab development in western Kansas, we are seeing a considerable amount of scab in the western part of the state. So I was in Wichita County earlier, and I was seeing a considerable amount of scab in that region, and especially concerning because the varieties in that region just don't have scab tolerance naturally, simply because it's not a common concern out there. So that's definitely one thing that we are seeing all over the state. I got visited with producers around Harrington, as far east as around Harrington or so, that were with very concerning levels of scab, even considering what they should do in terms of like haying the crop or not, because of as much scab as they were seeing. And then, of course, lower levels, but many different parts of the state where we're seeing scab.
And because it is so prevalent this year, we're going to devote still more time to this wheat scab problem and how growers might manage through it. Your colleague, Romulo K-State wheat disease specialist Kelsey Anderson, will be aboard on tomorrow's broadcast to dig deeper into that. Another product of the wet weather that you say was observed in numerous places, waterlogging of the crop, even to the point of considerable loss to that stand, Romulo.
Yes, Eric. So that was something that we were observing in that last week of May, first week of June. Actually, the first week of June, that's when I started seeing that. And essentially, we were traveling through several parts of the state every week. And on Monday of those weeks, early June, the crops were green and probably just going through that beginning of the grain filling period. And by Wednesday or Thursday, they were already turned white just from waterlogging. I think that the worst cases of waterlogging that we have, or at least that I have seen this year, was they are around Salina. So in that Saline County, Solomon, around that region, Gypsum. And so around that region, many of the fields were already turning white as early as in the early part of June. So again, it's important to remember that probably if the crop is under waterlogged conditions, this will create an anaerobic environment to the roots. And the roots, they need to respire as well. And so that anaerobic environment in the roots, if it's maintained for 24 to 48 hours, it can really start to cause premature death of the crop. And that's what we're seeing. And so talking to some growers this week, they mentioned that they are having the crop adjuster go and see for insurance purposes what's the extent of that damage. So definitely on some of the lower lying fields, we are seeing that considerable amounts of the fields were waterlogged, and that's really going to decrease or even total the yields and test weights on those areas. So that has been a bigger concern. I have seen few spots here and there of waterlogged wheat, even as far west as Ford County or even Wichita County. And so it's out there pretty much everywhere. But probably the worst cases that might even warrant the adjusters to go out and check for the conditions of the crop are probably going to be in that Saline area.
So those things have been going on, but there, by the same token, is good quality wheat out there, is there not?
There is definitely. So those conditions that I mentioned that were in place up to the early part of June, which are cool and moist conditions, they're excellent for our yield potential, right? And so probably for some of the crops that were already further along then, I think that the yield potential is going to be very strong, very high yield potential on those crops. Now, we have had for this last week or so several days where the temperatures were getting very high, close to 100 or even above 100 degrees, depending on the days there. And so that has some other effects to the crop as well, right? So we need to, the way that we kind of think of those high temperatures is that they usually, above certain thresholds, they will shut down the amount of sugars that the plant is producing and that transportation into the grain. So that kind of shuts down the accumulation of starch into the grain, which is what makes grain yield, right? At the same time, they tend to also improve our quality, improve the protein percent of that kernel, just because it's going to have less starch. So this heat stress that we have had in this last week, it really accelerated the crop development in many parts of the state. I was actually checking some of our own research plots around Atkinson, and there was already one combine in that region. And so in our plots, we're not quite there yet, but there was a neighboring field where the grower was already rolling and harvesting his wheat grain just this week. And so definitely this heat stress, it accelerated the crop development. And for parts of South Central Kansas, that's probably okay because the crop was far along enough that might not hurt yields as much, just finish up a little bit faster. Now in parts of North Central, Northwest Kansas, where the crop was not far along yet, that could have some significant yield loss because of heat stress in those parts of the state where maybe this heat stress is going to match with the early stages of grain filling, like the grain elongation phase, or even just those early milk stages of development. It could have a considerable amount of yield loss because of heat stress in those conditions.
Well, it's not long from now at all, full-blown harvest activity in Kansas. Romulo, we will touch base with you once again and catch your latest observations on this 2021 winter wheat crop in Kansas as the combines churn away. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric. And growers are welcome to follow me on social media at KSU Wheat. That's either on Twitter, Facebook, at KSU Wheat. And so I'll be posting the progress of our own harvest there as well. And growers can reach out directly to me with any questions or concerns.
Don't forget that opportunity to follow Romulo on social media at KSU Wheat. He keeps good information out there at hand for you producers. Romulo Lollato is a wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and we'll be back with more for you on this Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and once more for you, another installment of what we've dubbed FSA Coffee Talk, where we bring you up to the moment on developments with USDA farm programs out of your Farm Service Agency state headquarters for Kansas. Joining us once more, Agricultural Program Specialist with the Kansas FSA, Carla Wikoff. It's not, Carla, an extreme makeover, to put it that way, but the USDA has announced a reopening of the Conservation Reserve Program with a wealth of changes that producers should know about. These were posted recently. Most went into effect yesterday, the 14th of June. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. We have several different things that have happened with CRP, and I think they're trying to improve some things to get more interest in the CRP program. It's always been a great program in Kansas. So just want to start out by letting producers know we had a lot of producers that came in and signed up early on with the general CRP sign-up and continuous CRP sign-ups. And those producers will be getting letters from their offices, their service centers, asking them to come back and set up a time to resubmit their offers so that they can take advantage of the updates to the CRP. And I think they'll be happy with some of those updates, too.
Well, let's lend detail to that. And let's start with the general CRP, and to those who might resubmit their offers, what they'll be aiming for here.
Right. So general CRP sign-up, as we talked about, started yesterday, and it will run through July 23rd. So it's not a long period of time to get in your offices and get signed up, but those contracts then would become effective October 1st. The continuous CRP, that's ongoing at the same time. Any of the acreage that has some re-enrolled acreage in it where they would want to offer that, those would have to be done by the deadline of August 6th. And the effective date on those would be October 1 also. So new land on a continuous CRP, if it's only just new land, there's an opportunity to defer that effective date up to 6 months. So that's an ongoing sign-up. So there's not really a deadline right now for that.
One of the main interests here would be the adjustments that the USDA is making in those soil rental rates for CRP purposes.
Right. And we talked a little bit about this a little while back, but a little more information on that. They're doing an adjustment to the soil productivity index range. Before, it didn't go any higher than 100%. Now it runs from down to 50%, up to 150%, and it's based on the productivity of that soil. So it's based on the different types of soils that are out there for the what they're offering into CRP. Another item that they added to the soil rental rate is a one-time 10% inflationary adjustment to the county rental rate. So that should help with those situations where we know the Farm Bill had set in there that we could only use 85% of the rental rate for a general sign-up and 90% for a continuous. So this is to help bring that back up a little bit to help with those rental rates. The new soil rental rates, the county offices have that information now by map unit symbol, and each county office has a listing with all of that information on it. So if you're interested in CRP, visit with them, set up a time, and they can run what they call a scenario, a CRP scenario, and you can look and see what those rates would be on the land that you'd like to offer.
There's a new element that adds to all of that as well, and this is the Climate Smart Practice Incentive. What are the particulars on it?
Okay, so the Climate Smart Practice Incentive mainly covers 3 different cover types, and it has to do with the general CRP and continuous CRP practices, such as woody, biomass practices, like the tree practices. You get a 10% incentive to the rental rate. And on grass and legumes, you get a 5% incentive. And on just strictly grass practices, you get a 3% incentive. So another area where they're trying to raise those rental rates up a little bit better.
And that's not all. There's yet more incentive being provided specifically for the continuous CRP practices.
Correct. On the continuous CRP, we have the practice incentive payments. Previously, it was a little bit lower, but they've raised it up. And so it's at 50%, and that starts on yesterday, June 14th. As long as you didn't have a CRP contract approved at that point, you can take advantage of that extra 50%. So to give that perspective, we cost share 50% on putting a practice into place for CRP. And then we're going to give an additional, what we call it a PIP, it's practice incentive payment. We're going to give a 40% payment once completion of that practice is done and it's been certified. Then the additional 10% will come in year 5 of the CRP1 contract. So another area where they're helping get that cover on the ground.
You do the math there, that adds up to 100% incentive.
Right. Pretty good incentive.
And still building upon that, there is a water quality initiative worked into this?
Right. So there are some practices, and these are just on certain water quality practices that this is available, but it's an additional 20% added weighted average soil. And once again, that began on June 14th also. So all of these things, good to visit with your office to see what would work specifically to your own specific ground that you're wanting to put in CRP.
Well, there is another specific phase of CRP that we should cover as well here. This is the State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement, and it's aligned to specific wildlife needs within a given state, and we have a few of those sprinkled around Kansas.
Right. We actually have 2. We call them SAFE. You know, we have to make everything a little bit shorter to say. So we call them SAFE practices. So in Kansas, we have 2 SAFE practices. One is the lesser prairie chicken SAFE, and that's basically, you know, out on the western side of the state. And then there's also the upland game bird SAFE. That takes up a large portion of Kansas. There are some areas that were removed from that program in the last couple of years, but for the most part, a lot of the farm ground in Kansas is involved in that one also. Those SAFE practices include a sign-up incentive payment and then also the practice incentive. So once the practice is done, you can get an incentive on any new land that you're putting in there. So once again, we talked about that 50% on top of your cost share 50%. So helps get those practices in place. SAFE practices are also included in that Climate Smart Practice Incentive that's included there based on the practices that are enrolled in that program. So just a little bit about SAFE, and you may be hearing more about that. We We kind of have another one in the works, but it hasn't been approved yet. We're hoping in October it gets rolling. So stay tuned on safe practices in Kansas. We should have some more of that too.
And we've more to address here. The USDA features the Highly Erodible Land Initiative, and that's yet something different again. What's this about, Carla?
Okay, this practice is a continuous CRP practice. It has to meet the normal cropland requirements to be in CRP, just like all the other programs. But on top of that, it has the land that you're putting in this initiative has to have a weighted environmental index of 20 or greater. So very highly erodible land that goes into this program. With that said, any existing grass that's not currently enrolled in CRP, that's grass or perennial stands, that's not already in CRP is not eligible for this program. Once again, this highly erodible land initiative has a SIP and PIP that's authorized on new land for that. It also has the Climate Smart incentive. And those are basically practices that are either introduced grasses and legumes, permanent native covers, tree plantings, hardwood tree plantings, permanent wildlife, and then our rare and declining habitat practice. So there are some minimum requirements for that cover that have to be met, and this is also a 10-year contract.
And there's yet one more freshly announced USDA CRP opportunity for grasslands.
Yes, so yesterday they announced that CRP Grasslands sign-up would be happening soon. CRP Grasslands is a program that includes grasslands, rangeland, pasture land, and areas that have to do with grazing land. So being able to graze that and still get some payments from the government on that. So that sign-up begins July 12th and ends August 20th. And we don't have a lot of information on this yet, but more will be coming. One of the things I do want to mention is that it has a minimum soil rental rate of $15 per acre for the CRP grassland program. So we had some counties that, they were $7, $8, and $9, so that might help some of those that may have been interested in that program in the past. They're opening that back up. What I would say on this program is to stay tuned because we're going to have some more information forthcoming on that.
Very well. As you've stated numerous times, the best thing to do if any of this appeals to a landowner out there is to strike up a visit with your local FSA personnel, and they can walk you through all of these CRP opportunities, the new features added to the standard framework of the continuous and general CRP opportunities that are available to landowners. And Carla, thanks for going over all of that with us right here. Appreciate very much the word.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Carla Wikoff from the Farm Service Agency State Headquarters for Kansas on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And right to this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report, posted yesterday by the USDA. And for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture, to start with, at 4% surplus, 84% adequate, and 12% short to very short. The subsoil moisture at 4% surplus, 87% adequate, and 9% short to very short. Following up on Romulo Lollato's observations earlier in the broadcast, winter wheat condition in Kansas, according to the USDA, 64% good to excellent, 25% fair, 11% poor to very poor. Wheat coloring now at 79%, 84% is the average for the date, and wheat now mature is at 18%. Corn crop in Kansas, 75% good to excellent, 22% fair, and 3% poor to very poor. Corn emerging, 86% now. That is slightly behind the 91% average for the date. And the condition of the soybean crop in Kansas this week, 65% good to excellent, 27% fair, 8% poor to very poor. Soybean planting, 82%, that's near the average, and emergence at 63%, also near the average for the date. And grain sorghum, 74% good to excellent, 25% fair, 1% poor to very poor, with sorghum planted now at 60%, very near the average. Range and pasture conditions in Kansas this week, 60 make that 71% good to excellent, 24% fair, and 5% poor to very poor. Well, this past week saw a decline in corn and soybean condition ratings nationally, as we hear from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey notes a decline in corn condition ratings.
Largely across the northern Corn Belt due to heat and emerging dryness. At this point, June 13th, only 68% of the corn rated good to excellent. We have seen a 4-point drop in that number in each of the last 2 weeks. In other words, 2 weeks ago, the corn was 76% good to excellent.
Meanwhile,
we did not see any deterioration on the low end of the ratings. We're steady at 5% very poor to poor, same as last week.
He notes a similar decline in soybean condition ratings.
Soybeans now just 62% good to excellent, 8% very poor to poor. A week ago, those numbers were 67% and 6% respectively. So a 5-point drop out of the good to excellent, a 2-point increase in the very poor to poor.
Soybeans planted and soybean emergence are both ahead of schedule. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Meanwhile, the winter wheat harvest has reached 4% completion as of Sunday, behind the 5-year average of 15% for the date. Texas and Arkansas, 30 and 29% harvested, respectively. And the condition of the winter wheat crop nationally, 48% good to excellent this week, down from 50% the previous week. Spring wheat conditions falling again last week. The crop condition at 37% good to excellent. That was down a percentage point from the previous week. Still, the crop's current rating the lowest for this time of the year since 1988, even after last week's rain in the northern plains. And nationally, grain sorghum planted 72%, that's 3% behind the average, and sorghum headed 13%, also 3 percentage points behind the average. That's the update on crop conditions this week from the USDA. Now it's on to this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some issues we have during the summertime with our dairy herd. You know, one of the key issues that we face each summer here in Kansas is what happens to our repro program within our dairy herd during the summer months. And with the warmer weather coming, it'll start to have a negative impact on our herd's fertility very soon. As we think about what we can do, I know many of you concentrate on very extensive time breeding protocols, and we have all these protocols that we use, but, you know, a lot of times we really miss the thing that is really causing the issue. And the real issue is the fact that our animals are subject to heat stress. You know, the best breeding protocols that we can put together will not necessarily offset all the issues that we have with heat stress. And that's why when we look at our reproductive efficiency during the summertime, even though we've done an excellent job of putting these protocols together, we're not necessarily satisfied with the results that we see. So, rather than just trying another breeding protocol, let's talk about some other things that might be more important, and that would be managing the heat stress levels on your farm. You know, when you start to see animals that are breathing heavily, 80, 90 breaths per minute or more, that means that their body temperature has already increased above the level that they could maintain a pregnancy, particularly early after fertilization. See, one of the things that really hurts us as we look at heat stress and reproduction within our dairy herd is when these animals become heat stressed, if conception is just a few days previous, this heat stress or increase in body temperature will likely terminate many of those pregnancies. The other issue that happens is animals that are subject to heat stress, they generally start to have longer heat cycles. When the heat cycles become longer and they ovulate less often, that means that we also have an issue with the age of the egg. So these animals, even though they may still ovulate, may still show some signs of heat, they also probably will have much lower conception rates than if they were on a normal cycle. If you don't manage the heat stress in your lactating dairy cows, it's going to probably be difficult to be very successful, regardless of which repro program that you might be using. So let's get back to the basics. Let's concentrate on the things that we really should be doing to keep our cows from being subjected to all of the heat stress during the summertime. Again, those things like fans with plenty of airflow, 7, 8, 9 miles an hour over the top of the cow as she lays in her bed, as well as implementing feedline soakers to give additional cooling during the summer months is very, very important. Now, once you've taken care of those things, it is time to take a look at your repro program. Sit down with your veterinarian or the person that handles the repro recommendations on your dairy and make sure that you haven't had any drift in your protocols. Many times as I visit with dairymen, I find that we have some issues with some things that we're doing within the protocol. Maybe we started out with a very standardized protocol, but over time, sometimes some things creep in, and we need to just reevaluate whether or not we're using something that should be effective. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to think about what they can do to help their cows become pregnant during the summer months.
Thanks, Mike, and we'll be back on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today concludes on wildlife management once again. Charlie Lee is aboard for his regular visit on a Tuesday, former wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. The interaction of prairie dogs and grazing areas, once again examined in new research out of South Dakota. We want to center on that today, Charlie. That report was just put out, but this is a subject that has drawn immense attention over the years.
Yes, we've talked about prairie dogs and livestock competition many times. We know that black-tailed prairie dogs have been identified as a keystone species. They do lots of things, including increase plant biodiversity, provide habitat for other wildlife species. They increase biotic diversity and diversity of plant community structure. Unfortunately, prairie dogs can reduce the carrying capacity on rangelands by up to 50% through the direct consumption of vegetation and by clipping plants. So they reduce that available forage to increase predator detection. They do it when they're building mounds, and it changes the species composition. That colonization in a rangeland by prairie dogs subsequently increases in grazing pressure that eventually shifts the plant communities from a midgrass-dominated area to those that are characterized by high cover of perennial short grasses initially, and eventually dominated by annual forbs or broadleaf plants. Some people would call those weeds. Because grasses are what's used extensively by prairie dogs, they eventually lose their competitive advantage over other plants, and the old core areas in prairie dog towns are then characterized by a high percentage of bare ground, low vegetation production, and typically a domination by annual forbs. The outer edges of prairie dog colonies may still have a good mix of plant groups.
They do leave their mark, there's no doubt. So what did this latest multi-year study want to examine here? More about how prairie dogs compete for that forage, that vegetation with livestock?
Well, they wanted several objectives. They wanted to evaluate the relationship between on and off prairie dog town plant communities and where cattle grazed. And then they wanted to identify patterns and trends in livestock grazing behavior throughout the growing season. Then they wanted to evaluate the diet and nutrient composition and intake by cattle on the plant communities that were on prairie dog towns as well as those that were off towns, again, over the grazing season. And then to study the livestock performance in response to the level of the prairie dog occupation within those pastures.
So how did they go about gathering that information?
They used 3 pastures that were established to have varying levels of prairie dog occupation. That was either at 0%, 20%, and 40%. Then historic photos of the area showed that prairie dogs were present as early as 1930s, with larger scale colony expansions occurring in the 1980s. The pastures are grazed continuously by yearling steers from June until early October, and the stocking rate was set at 50% total. That would be cattle plus prairie dog utilization. That seemed somewhat unusual in that most people, unfortunately, don't take that into account. They tend to stock the pastures the same and thus end up vastly overgrazing those pastures that have a higher percent of occupancy by prairie dogs.
Then getting into the results, what did they come up with in quantifying the impact on the gains, the quality of forage presented, and so forth?
Well, the forage quality and the intake by cattle was estimated by using ruminally fistulated steers that were allowed to graze for 30 minutes within each plant community. And then the rumen samples were weighed and analyzed for forage quality. The livestock grazing preference decreased on prairie dog grass sites, but it increased on the no prairie dog sites throughout the growing season. The crude protein content was significantly higher on the prairie dog forb sites, which is what you would expect because many broadleaf plants have much higher quality of crude protein than grass species. There were a few differences in forage quality that were evident between the prairie dog grass and the no prairie dog colonies. So it looked like the main difference was in the heart of those towns that were dominated by forbs, the pure grass sites either on or off colony, and a few prairie dogs did not see a significant difference. The intake on the prairie dog forb sites was greatly reduced. It was reduced almost 60% compared with the no prairie dog sites. So you can see, even though the quality was better on those sites, there's not a lot of intake from livestock occurring on those sites.
What conclusions can be drawn then from those results, do you think, as we look to the ongoing question of prairie dogs competing with grazing cattle?
Well, I think the most important thing that a producer must consider is to set the appropriate stocking rates. And you've got to consider the consumption by prairie dogs in those calculations. You got to decide how long the prairie dogs have been on the area, what the plant communities have done. Have they changed? Are they dominated by forbs or annual grasses where you're not getting much intake? Be aware that there's going to be some trade-offs between performance and production. You've got to utilize some good data collection, either aerial photography or on-site GPS work to figure out the acres occupied within each pasture by prairie dogs in order to help you make those stocking rate determinations. In places where you've got a high proportion of prairie dog colonization within a pasture, the stocking rates that don't account for that forage that's being removed by prairie dogs is going to result in overgrazing. And subsequently, overgrazing accelerates prairie dog colony expansion. So I think that's what we can learn from this information, is that failure to take that into account can lead to significant rangeland deterioration.
Information that was generated by, again, a new study out of South Dakota looking at this interaction of prairie dogs and livestock in grazing areas. Charlie, thanks for going over this with us. Former wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. That closes out this Tuesday edition, and as always, thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.